I'm not doing this as a YouTuber. I'm doing this as an American citizen, okay? I hate the fact that I'm an American citizen, but I'm privileged to be, so I'm thankful to be. I will be addressing the racial injustice here in America, the injustice that our fellow African Americans have experienced their whole lives. And I am so sorry. I'm here to listen and to educate myself. Okay? I don't want to make this about anything else other than you. Okay? So, I'm going to be reading off a Word document because I don't want to mess this up. I don't want to mess it up. My sister Megan so graciously took the time out of her day to write this. And though these aren't my own words, I wholeheartedly stand behind them. And I wish to share them with you guys. Okay? I would attempt to do this myself, but I'm not dealing too well with this 2020 update. Okay? The glitches, the bugs, they've gotten to me. And I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the patch. Anyways. I want to start by saying I'm doing this because I didn't feel comfortable sharing the donation links like everybody else. The petitions, I didn't feel comfortable sharing those. Because I wanted to use my platform in the most highly efficient way possible. I want you guys to know that I am genuinely committed to learning and to sharing your story and sharing what you have to fight through, something I will never understand. First, I want to say Black Lives Matter. Black pain matters. Black happiness matters. Black prosperity and protection matters. Black people have overcome so many obstacles that white people created, and I urge my non-black subscribers to recognize that it should not be on black people to dismantle a system white people created. As non-black people, it is our time to listen, educate ourselves, and actively partake in anti-racism. Perhaps my video is meant for non-black audiences because I've decided that my platform is best used to educate you guys in ways that you might expect a black person to do so. But it's not up to black people to educate us on what is going on. There are endless resources available, and I've compiled some information for us to go through. As a white person, I've been so ignorant to the reality of Black Americans. The first instance of police brutality I was exposed to was the case of Philando Castile in 2016. At a traffic stop, Philando was shot at 7 times. 5 bullets hit him while he was sat in his car with his hands up with his 4-year-old daughter in the back seat. The killer cop was charged with second-degree manslaughter and 2 accounts of dangerous discharge of a weapon. But he was acquitted of all charges. Philando's murder was caught on camera, and his murderer was acquitted of all
3 charges, including second-degree manslaughter.
I want to mention that Philando lived in Minnesota, not far from where George Floyd was sadistically and slowly murdered by a police officer. It's also not enough to have conversations with our kind of racist friends and family. We need to get into the facts and educate our ignorant friends and family. Here are different forms of racism we need to be aware of. Interpersonal racism. Prejudices are when one group makes assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of other groups based on race. This set of prejudices manifests into discrimination, which is the cruel, intentional, or unintentional actions and behaviors towards other groups. Internalized racism. In a society in which all aspects of identity and experience are racialized, and one group is politically, socially, and economically dominant, members of stigmatized groups who are bombarded with negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth may internalize these negative messages. It holds people back from achieving their fullest potential. It also obscures the structural and systematic nature of racial oppression and reinforces those systems. Institutional racism, where assumptions about race are structured into the social and economic institutions in our society. Institutional racism occurs when organizations, businesses, or institutions like schools and police departments are discriminative, either deliberately or indirectly, against certain groups of people to limit their rights. This type of racism reflects the cultural assumptions of the dominant group. Structural racism. This refers to the accumulation over centuries of the effects of racialized society. Think again about the creation of the white middle class and what it means today to have been left out of that process of wealth creation, home ownership, college education, etc. If race no longer matters, how do we explain persistent disparities among groups and disproportionate levels of poverty, incarnation, unemployment, etc. in communities of color? We can't. Not without talking about structural racism. Let's talk about the creation of the white middle class. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal after the Great Depression in order to build America back up. This is what led up to today's white middle class. The New Deal purposely disenfranchised Black Americans, and we are witnessing the consequences of that today. Let's recall how racism can be built into supposedly neutral and universal reforms, such as the New Deal legislation. Social Security, labor laws, 30-year instead of 5-year mortgages, and the GI Bill. These government programs were critical to the creation of the white middle class. 2 or 3 generations of white people were able to buy homes, be assured that their parents would not be dependent on them for support as they aged, and many were able to go to college. All of this was less true for African Americans. Most of the New Deal programs discriminated against Black people. The National Recovery Administration not only offered whites the first crack at jobs, but also authorized separate and lower pay scales for Black people. The Federal Housing Authority refused to guarantee mortgages for Black Americans who tried to buy in non-Black neighborhoods. And the CCC maintained segregated camps. The Social Security Act excluded jobs Black people traditionally filled. Fuck me, shit. The story in agriculture is particularly grim. Since 40% of all Black workers made their living as sharecroppers and tenant farmers on white-owned farms, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, acreage reduction hit Black people very hard. White landlords could make more money by leaving land untilled than by putting land back into production. As a result, the AAA's policy forced more than 100,000 Black people off the land in 1933 and 1934. The president even failed to support an anti-lynching bill and a bill to abolish the poll tax. Let's talk about policies that perpetuate structural racism. These policies allow for the segregation of resources and risk. Redlining, subprime lending, high-risk mortgages to Black families, certain zoning policies that affects education, toxic dumping policies, and use of property taxes to fund public education. These policies create inherited groups of disadvantage or advantage. Intergenerational transfer of wealth through estate inheritance, lack of reparations for historical injustices, and admissions procedures at universities such as legacies, which is where you can get into a prestigious school because your fucking grandpa went there. I gotta burp. Ugh. These policies allow for the differential valuation in human life by race. Curriculum policies that teach Eurocentric histories, racial profiling, and discretionary sentencing. Culturally empowering curriculum is so important to the Institute in our education system. People love saying African American, but we never learn about African history at school. They beat us over the head with boo-woo every year, but we never learn about African poets, writers, rhetors, inventors, and philosophers. Studies show that white students are subtly culturally empowered by the Eurocentric curriculum. These policies limit the self-determination of certain groups of people. policies that result in disproportionate incarnation rates for minorities and their subsequent disenfranchisement, and lack of proportional representation in elections and decision making. Historical and current racist policies that perpetuate structural racism are the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA. As noted, some reforms that were assumed to be race neutral have perpetuated race-based inequities. NLRB is one example, because it excluded farm and domestic workers who were predominantly African American in the 1930s. Mandatory minimum drug sentencing. In the 1980s, this became a key mechanism in the war on crime, which targeted communities of color in the wake of the civil rights movement. Zero tolerance policies in schools. This became another mechanism for criminalizing and stigmatizing youth of color instead of addressing systematic problems affecting our schools. Reminder, a 6-year-old black elementary school student was handcuffed and arrested because she was acting up at school. The special education programs in schools are also riddled with discrimination. Black students with learning disabilities are less likely to succeed in school and be reintroduced into regular classes. All of the discrepancies between whites and communities of colors that we see today, the wealth gap, the education gap, higher incarnation rates, higher unemployment rates, and the disparities in health outcomes are evident of structural racism. Segregation in housing and discrimination in lending have cumulative effects. Fewer sources of family wealth, as well as fewer investments in and limited services for communities of color, which directly affects the quality of schools and communities of color. According to the data from the U.S. Federal Reserve, more than half of companies that have black owners were turned down for loans, a rate twice as high as white business owners. The report found that while black-owned firms were the most likely to have applied for bank financing, less than 47% of these applications were fully funded. Even when black business owners get approved, their rate of failure to receive full financing is the highest amongst all categories by more than 10%. The report also found that black-owned businesses were the most likely groups to have applied for a credit card and experienced the highest turn-down rate. For those that applied for bank financing, a smaller share of the black-owned and Hispanic-owned businesses received loans of $100,000 or more as compared to all other ethnic groups. So white people and white business owners have more access to money in order to start businesses, create jobs, and contribute to their white societies. The thing to remember about structural racism is that it no longer requires racist actors. It is built into the institutions and practices. Getting rid of a racist person does not change the practices. The critical aspect of racism that we must address today is the accumulation and incorporation of long-standing racist practices into all of our social and economic structures. Music, fashion, sports, television, and film. Black people continue to set the trend on what is popular. Despite the popularity of black people continue to face discrimination, racism, and criticism on a daily basis. It is evident that black culture continues to remain popular, while black people do not. As white people, we can't pat ourselves on the back when we retweet Black Lives Matter and cancel celebrities when we find videos of them saying the N-word. It's not enough. It is the entire system in which our society functions that needs to be drastically changed and revolutionized. White silence is violence. Let us take our knowledge of racist policies and go to our lawmakers and demand change. I respect the police officers taking a knee alongside the protesters, but that's just the beginning. Time for change in all social and economic systems that have advanced the whites and disenfranchised black people. Policies regarding health, employment, community, housing, criminal justice, and education need to change, and we won't stop until they are changed. Don't gaslight black people by telling them rioting isn't right, and peaceful protests are the way to be heard. We see how y'all treated Colin Kaepernick's protest. I see many of the same people who cry, "Eat the rich," saying looting Target isn't the answer. Despite the fact that most violent looters are white agitators and not a part of the protest, do not make the focus of this entire movement about replaceable merchandise, buildings, and capitalism. Our fellow Black Americans' lives are not replaceable. We must fiercely fight for their right to life. Do what you can. Take your skills and strengths and contribute to anti-racism. Do not be silent and do not let up until laws and policies are changed. Go on to the front lines of protest and make your demands, knowing the facts and laws that need to change. It wasn't only Derek Chauvin's knee crushing George Floyd's neck. It was an entire racist system on top of him crushing his life. It's time we step on the neck of racism and don't let up until equality is fully achieved.